War started, I was 7 years old, and I experienced very early and witnessed also very early what it means to face human rights violations. I couldn't name it at the time, but I suddenly found myself being discriminated against. So it was these experiences that motivated me to gain the knowledge and the skills needed to help those who cannot help themselves because, or at least to support their fight by standing by their side because I've been there. And I know what it means.
Through her own experience as a refugee during the Bosnian War, Adrijana Hanušić Bećirović knows that everyone's story is important on the path to justice. By listening to victims' experiences as a human rights lawyer and activist, Adrijana brings the hidden stories of war crimes into the light of reality and fights for a secure future. Thank you for joining Lynn Foley, host of Remarkable Women, Powerful Stories, as we hear from Adrijana about her journey.
I believe that the foundation of my activism was primarily set by the idealism of my father, which was instilled within me through observing his activism and listening to the stories he shared with me at a very young age. He spoke to me with this sparkle in his eyes about the necessity to fight for equality in society, regardless of any differences in origin or social status. And he taught me that we must strive to live in harmony and be united in our diversity. And he in turn inherited this idealism from his parents. His father, my grandfather, was a professional musician, and he left in the early 20s to participate as a partisan in battling fascism across Europe during World War II.
Mm-hmm.
And when in Bijeljina, his hometown in northeastern part of Bosnia and Herzegovina was liberated, he brought his unit to the courtyard of his family home, where they celebrated with the sounds of his accordion. During this period, my grandmother, who was very young at the time, around 15 years old, was carrying hidden messages as part of the resistance movement, concealing them in her long braids as she walked 10 kilometers in the darkness to reach neighboring villages. So both my grandparents volunteered further in post-war youth reconstruction efforts, contributing to projects such as the construction of the railway. And my grandmother did extensive community work through the Red Cross, local humanitarian assistance projects. And then in the 70s, she became part of a group of first elected female councillors in the Bijeljina Municipal Council. So there is this long thread of idealism and commitment to the greater good in my father's family line. But at the same time, it was my mother's pragmatism that enabled me to put this idealism into practice, into action. She taught me to always keep an analytical eye and critical eye on the environment and dynamics I'm involved within, and to keep a continuous deep self-reflection process going. I was born in Bijeljina, in the town I mentioned, where I enjoyed a very privileged family life with my parents and my older sister. And then in 1992, when I was 7 years old, the war started and our world turned upside down. After 2 years of living under constant fear, we were forced to leave this very same city where my ancestors had left such a significant impact. At the age of 9, we fled to Germany, where we spent 4.5 years. And then in 1998, we again were made to return to our home country. The values I inherited from my family, combined with those experiences we endured during the war, have given me this strong sense of responsibility and urgency to tackle various issues I would observe in our society. So from an early age, it became clear to me that I wanted to dedicate myself to fighting for justice and equality and to improving the lives of those whose rights have been violated.
So that historical background or platform is is obviously so terribly important for you as a woman today and as a young girl as you went through particularly those challenges of leaving your country and then returning some years later as a small child. So I'm aware, as a result of that, and then in the way in which your career has taken you and your study, that you've lived in a number of different countries and you speak a range of languages. I'm keen to hear how you navigated the experiences of changing countries, cultures, and languages from that early age, and maybe share a few positives and the challenges you faced during that time.
That's an interesting one. I'm a so-called third culture kid, and I take great pride in this fact. I consider it a privilege. You know, this is like a hidden superpower, allowing you to shift smoothly, not only between languages, but also between cultures, mindsets, and worldviews. It enables you to feel at home and easily fit in within various systems. This experience provides you with some kind of a macro perspective on things. But at first, it was really challenging. I will never forget the moment when my mom, with worried eyes, let me enter a third grade classroom full of children where I couldn't speak or understand a single word. Luckily, after walking around every day with my small yellow dictionary, I picked up the language quite quickly. Within 6 months, I could already speak perfect German. And after another 6 months, my accent was indistinguishable from that of native speakers. And I think that the fact that I've been a bookworm since 5 years old helped a lot, because I signed up for this beautiful school library, and I would ride my bike home with 10 new books every 3 days.
In German, of course, I'm assuming.
Yes, of course. Yeah, that's why it helped with the language. But I do think that, you know, this experience left its traces. For instance, during my master's studies in France, in Strasbourg, as a French government scholarship holder, my French was just insufficient when I arrived there for that level of education. So I completely froze for 2 months. It took a lot of encouragement and self-belief to just give it a chance and to kick off the learning process. But I was lucky to receive both this encouragement and the belief in myself, primarily from my mother's father, my deceased grandfather, who was always my biggest supporter. So during our time in Germany, we swapped, you know, the spacious flat we had in Vilna for 2 tiny little rooms in a hotel in a fancy neighborhood, which had been adapted to a refugee camp. And just around the corner lived a woman called Frau Requat, who called me her wish child, and she was kind of a fairy tale grandmother to me. We wrote letters to each other. I spent a lot of time with her, gardening, bird watching, walking and cycling to the nearby woods. She taught me to play the piano and flute. I got to know and to celebrate all those beautiful local traditions. And as I grow older, I realize how much she contributed to my healing from this wartime experience, and I'm immensely grateful for it. And it makes me often think, also reflect on how powerful such friendships can be for all those little girls and boys around the globe who find themselves right now as refugees in a similar situation. Over
and
time,
whether there's an older person to help them. I'm sorry to interrupt you there, Adriana, but whether there's an older person, in the case here, it was like a grandmother for you, that takes them, we would say in our country, under their wing, provides them with that love and care and compassion. So I guess that's what you're talking about in terms of that friendship, and many more since then for you.
Yes, sometimes I think about maybe devising some projects, which would be centered around this model of friendship, which could maybe occur in an organized manner, and bring elderly people who are maybe lonely, living without their children, grandchildren, together with such kind of refugee children, and enable them to be empowered and to change their lives for better. So over time, I really, this new culture really became one important part of my identity. I remember when I came back to Germany in 2008, 10 years after returning to Bosnia for a scholarship program at the German parliament in Berlin. And a fellow colleague from Bosnia and Herzegovina commented, "Those folks are crazy," when he saw that everybody received a large folder with colored instructions, fully planning in advance our 6-month stay there. And at the same time, I just felt this immense joy at seeing such detailed, colorful planning ahead. It really felt like coming home, and I think it's a very German thing.
Probably is. You've talked already a little bit about the influence your family and these experiences have had on you. When it came time to choose study pathways, then career, how did you go about making those decisions to meet your goals that you had as a very young girl about working in the sphere, particularly in the sphere of equality?
When the war started, I told you I was 7 years old, and I experienced very early and witnessed also very, very early what it means to face human rights violations. I couldn't name it at the time, but I suddenly found myself being discriminated against based on my perceived ethnic origin without even fully understanding what that origin was, because I was raised Yugoslav. So we received threatening phone calls at night warning that people would come in and kill us. My father lost his job. We lost our flat. And after 2 years of living in an occupied city, my family finally managed to flee. And then in Germany, we faced other kinds of challenges. So it was these experiences that motivated me to gain the knowledge and the skills needed to help those who cannot help themselves, because, or at least to support their fight by standing by their side, because I've been there and I know what it means. Over time, I learned to integrate those painful experiences into something meaningful. There is this strong sense of helplessness and unfairness associated with such kind of experiences. And for me, law and the human rights paradigm appear to be powerful tools and an antidote to those feelings. And this is why I have always been fascinated about the international order grounded in human rights standards that guide or can pressure nations all around the globe to align their domestic laws and their domestic practices with such standards. This is why I chose to study law and to combine it with international law. My goal was just to obtain the necessary knowledge, the skills, the tools, which would enable me to bring truth to power, to fight injustices and discrimination against innocent people who just happen to find themselves at the wrong place at the wrong time. And these tools are needed to adapt the harsh realities our societies are facing to the desirable human rights standards, because human rights ultimately have this potential channel, or are this potential channel through which we can bring back power to the oppressed, power to the ordinary citizens. And closely linked to my focus on achieving justice is also my desire to contribute to upholding meaningful peace and creating meaningful peace and promoting reconciliation. Because for many of my fellow citizens born in the 80s, peace has never just been an abstract concept. When you find yourself as a child wishing while blowing out the candles on your birthday cake for the wars to stop instead for traditional birthday presents, and when you find yourselves repeating this wish year after year, you can never again be indifferent to the absence of genuine peace. Nor can you lack deep empathy for people similarly suffering all over the world. So amidst the difficult experiences of the war, luckily there were also some moments of humanity, friends who sometimes risked their lives, risked serious consequences to help us in various situations. And these moments kept my belief in humanity and reaffirmed the need to keep categorizing people only into two categories, the good individuals and the bad individuals. So these experiences have affected, influenced on a very profound level who I am today, because having lived through so many different separate ecosystems of cultures, ethnic groups, countries, it has given me this meta perspective, allowing me to understand that people are shaped by their surroundings. And it became clear to me that it's often just a matter of chance where you're born that shapes your attitudes, including the very extreme ones. It's as simple as that. And keeping this in mind has given me the strength to think twice before condemning someone. It has given me the hope which is needed to listen to different perspectives, even if they seem very different from mine, and then to try to find some common ground with such people.
And that's a very difficult and challenging situation for all of us, isn't it, to find that common ground and to withhold judgment and withhold judgment's the only word I can think of. So if we move on now to, I did notice on LinkedIn recently in your profile that you've had the opportunity to come together with other extraordinary women leaders to advance the field of traditional justice and the peace and security agenda, and of course, gender-based violence. Can you explore a little bit of how those organisations and leaders are coming together to make a difference in those fields?
Sure. The field of transitional justice is a very important one for several reasons, because the absence of war is just the beginning of a long path towards true peace. And this is a path which shall be marked by establishing the truth, enabling access to justice, providing reparations, acknowledgement of the harm done. And this is where transitional justice mechanisms come in. Transitional justice refers to how countries are dealing with the consequences of widespread violence and human rights abuses. But it is at the same time also a tool for democratization and societal change. There is no alternative to this. We cannot build the conditions for a prosperous future without having properly dealt with our past. And I have always been passionate about ensuring redress for human rights violations that have already occurred, but also about creating these systemic conditions needed to prevent further violations from happening. And this is why I have dedicated nearly 15 years of my life to supporting transitional justice efforts, the fight against impunity, and ensuring access to justice and reparations for victims of war crimes, former camp detainees, families of missing persons, and survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. I have been doing this primarily through my role as a senior legal advisor at an NGO called Transitional, where I had been creating legal strategies and advocacy strategies that have led to victories in individual cases where, for instance, perpetrators would be brought behind bars, but also to provoking systemic changes on a societal level. In 2015, we at Trial International triggered a major breakthrough when, for the first time in the Western Balkans in history, a survivor of conflict-related sexual violence, and in general a war crime victim, was awarded compensation in criminal proceedings in parallel to pronouncing the prison sentence against the perpetrator. And since then, through additional efforts we invested, this became common practice in Bosnia and Herzegovina, at least with regard to CRSV crimes. It was at that time a creative advocacy strategy that led to this outcome. We combined policy research and meetings with stakeholders and media, outreach, litigation tools in order to achieve this desired change. For survivors, it is important that perpetrators are punished, that they are properly punished. But compensation also sends a very strong message. It sends the message that someone must take responsibility for the harm they have done. And as the survivor from the very first case stated, when she learned about this positive outcome, it is important for me to be able to tell my daughter that when somebody does something wrong, he has to pay for it. So through my work at Trial International, I have continuously tried to ensure the implementation of relevant international standards and recommendations. Sometimes we trigger the issuance of recommendations by UN treaty bodies through submitting shadow reports to them or the European Commission. And once the recommendations were issued, we use them then at the domestic level, urging local stakeholders to implement them by aligning their domestic laws and practices with those recommendations and those international standards.
Yeah.
And this is how we change several laws and influence various policies. For instance, the policy of the prosecutor's office to prioritize the prosecution of conflict-related sexual violence crimes, because traditionally they have been regarded as lesser crimes. Or introducing a legal obligation for the Ministry of Justice to represent victims of gender-based violence in criminal proceedings, and many more. In 2022, our advocacy work resulted in the first legal recognition of children born of wartime rape in Bosnia and Herzegovina, but also in Europe, as civilian victims of war. And we did it together with the Association of Forgotten Children of War, who have for years been doing enormous awareness-raising activities, very courageous awareness-raising activities about their existence and their needs and rights. In 2019, Trial ensured a positive outcome before the UN Committee Against Torture, representing a victim of conflict-related sexual violence. And this was a global first. And it was also the first time that Bosnia and Herzegovina has found to have committed a violation of human rights of its citizens. And 1 year before that, we did the same on behalf of a survivor of CRSV before the Committee Against Discrimination, Committee Against Discrimination Against Women. Such cases are part of strategic litigation, strategic human rights litigation efforts, which means working on a concrete case aimed at securing a concrete outcome for a survivor or a victim, while also striving for general recommendations to be issued, which will then affect a broader community, a broader group of victims. And I think that as professionals, we must never forget that sometimes even the simple act of assistance and solidarity can mean the world to someone in a difficult situation. It may have even a therapeutic effect if it is conducted, the communication, the interaction is conducted in a trauma-sensitive and a survivor-centered manner. But the moments I have always been most grateful for have always been those where you can touch people's lives and where you can change them for the better. And
so I just wanted to actually move a little bit forward with that notion of touching people's lives. I wondered, when we first met, we talked a lot about the power of storytelling, and we talked a lot about having a powerful voice. So I just wanted to inject at this point for you to share. You've had, as a much sought after global person, global woman who is very articulate and experienced, you've developed this voice that's being listened to and heard, and you can make a difference. So I'm wondering if you'd like to share some views about the power of voice and the power of storytelling and how they come together to allow you to do the work that you do that might inspire others to consider about sharing their own stories and using their own voice.
On a global level, the main focus of my work in the field of transitional justice has been what I've just described. And part of it was to share lessons learned through participation in international workshops, like the one LinkedIn post showed, where, for instance, practitioners from Colombia, Ukraine, Bosnia, and Kosovo were gathered to share best practices, lessons learned about mistakes made, and some successful strategies to advancing the women, peace, and security agenda and protect the rights of survivors. Now I'm, for Vital Voices, doing this by transferring knowledge to Ukrainian civil society organizations in the field of transitional justice and CRSV documentation. And over the years, I have also contributed to the development of some key international guidelines, including the Murad Code or the UK government's second edition PSVI protocol on documentation of sexual violence and the principles on preventing stigmatization associated with those crimes. When it comes to storytelling, this is something which is very close to my heart, because a great inspiration for me, for my work, comes from the stories and the faces of all the victims, of all the survivors I have been working with, as well as of some friends and relatives I know which are affected. And as Mother Teresa famously told, "If I look at the mass, I will never act. And if I look at the one, I will."
Yes.
It's these very concrete examples and these very concrete phases that keep me moving forward. And this is also why I have relied heavily on storytelling throughout my advocacy work, my awareness raising and capacity building efforts. I've learned that while statistics can be a powerful tool, can engage people's minds on a cognitive level, even the most horrific situations people find themselves in often remain abstract in your listener's mind, because especially in relation to grave human rights violations, these experiences are just so difficult to grasp, to understand. So I've learned that while statistics can be powerful, there is so much power in personal stories. When you combine data with concrete stories about how an individual's life is affected by a situation, it really becomes a game changer. And when you can reach someone's heart, you can also inspire them to act. And I have seen this time and again. Let me illustrate just through one example. When I began working in the field of transitional justice around 2010, I was preparing about 50 applications to the Constitutional Court on behalf of 50 families of missing persons from Prijedor. And part of this work was gathering and then presenting those application stories from the families. And I'll never forget this one story about a family whose loved one was arbitrarily arrested by soldiers in a village near Prijedor and then went missing. And the last thing that they remember about him is at their doorstep, him trying to grab his shoes before being taken away. And one of the soldiers told him not to bother. He told him, "You won't need them anymore." And this was one of the very few cases of the 50 applications where we succeeded in bringing the perpetrators behind bars. The very soldier who made that chilling remark in front of his family. I guess it has also affected the judicial actors reading it. After hearing such a story, you know, it's impossible not to empathize with the family and not to feel compelled to act. And the opportunity to tell these stories can come in written form, but most often it comes through speeches, through training sessions, through conversations with lawmakers. Just take the example of awarding compensation in criminal proceedings. A prosecutor might not see the value in focusing on this aspect of the proceeding. But then you can try to illustrate very concrete examples of concrete individuals. What is at stake for them? How this would affect their lives if the prosecutor were to act. And then sometimes you see this shift in people's eyes happening as they are listening to such a story. And you hear them saying, "Why not? Let's try to break new ground." And that's such a powerful moment. I have felt humbled and moved every time I witness such a shift. For me, these are probably amongst the most beautiful and rewarding moments a human rights lawyer can experience.
So in hearing constantly those stories and in the work that you do, can you talk to us about the balance between personal well-being, personal growth, alongside that mental and physical energy that's required to carry forward such a huge change agenda? How do you look after yourself and reduce that risk of burnout from the sort of work you're engaged in?
This is such an important discussion, and thank you very much for raising it. I'm very happy to observe in the last years that we've seen a shift in how vulnerability is addressed and mental health issues are addressed in professional circles. Burnout in particular has always been a significant issue within this community of change makers who are pushing boundaries. So it is essential to talk about it and to share strategies on how to prevent it and how to overcome it, in order to ensure that as many people as possible can continue keeping up the good work, continue fighting for a world as it should be, opposed to the world as it is. So burnout can result, which is the most obvious thing, from overworking. And I worked really hard for a long period of time because there is this natural inclination to overwork and neglect self-care when faced with such immense human suffering. You know, thinking about your physical and mental state in those circumstances can feel like a luxury. But this is a pitfall to be avoided if for no other reason than because it's crucial to remain effective in advancing the rights of others for a long period of time, as long as possible.
Yes.
However, my personal experience with burnout shows that the danger of burnout wasn't so much about the number of hours invested and the energy invested into fighting for my causes. It was more linked to negative outcomes that kept occurring despite all those efforts by me, by my team, by a web of allies from different organizations. So I've mentioned before how empowering it can feel to have solid legal arguments and strategic planning on your side. These tools can counteract the feeling of helplessness that's intrinsically linked to human rights violations. And it's a feeling that victims carry with them, but it also can become part of your experience when you work closely with them. And yet sometimes, even if your arguments would be indisputable in an impartial courtroom, when you're advocating for something, especially in the political arena, it doesn't matter how good your arguments are. It's just like talking to a wall, because your interlocutors have been instructed not to follow your proposals. And this is a constant reality in a society like Bosnia and Herzegovina, a divided post-conflict society with a highly dysfunctional political system. And while there have been moments I described where my stories, my arguments have seemed to move mountains, there have also been painful moments when ignorant officials, driven by their political agendas, remained immune to the suffering of victims. So for me, this is the toughest part of the job, when you can't convince people to do the right thing despite all the efforts you are investing. And it's not because your arguments are flawed, but because there's a lack of empathy for fellow human beings and because of the political agendas. And these situations can quickly send you back into this old feeling of helplessness. I believe that this is where the danger of burnout is most pronounced in this profession, especially if your core driving force is tied to a personal experience involving those feelings, the same feelings in the face of injustice and indifference. But there are also ways to continue despite all of this, pushing stakeholders to try harder. It's crucial to be aware of these psychological dynamics and to maintain this long-term perspective despite setbacks. You need to be prepared for the fact that it's not going to be a sprint, but a marathon, you know? And even though things might not work out in the short term, you must just keep your eyes on the prize and just keep going. It's important to remember that even if you cannot right every wrong immediately, the effects of our efforts may show much later on, or they might have a ripple effect without us ever knowing about it. And that's okay too. Even without these quick, concrete results we might desire, it doesn't mean we can't or we shouldn't continue to affect the lives of others wherever we see an opportunity to do so. But it is important, in order to achieve this, to work on yourself. You asked me, like, what are my strategies? Alongside my efforts to create peace in the outside world, achieving inner peace has been essential for an intensive personal growth process, because personal growth builds resilience. And resilience is crucial for sustaining this difficult work over time. So you have to build a strong support network of family, friends, and like-minded individuals all around the globe, as well as maintain hobbies like reading, music, and in my case, also a deep connection to nature, which is always healing.
So as we lean towards finishing our conversation today, Adrijana, and we could continue this conversation for twice the amount of time, what do you think at this stage in your life and career are your greatest leadership gifts? Just one or two.
I think that the talents, the skills, and the knowledge one has been given are there for a reason, because there is a correlated responsibility to use them for the common good, contributing to our society's most pressing issues. And I think that my greatest leadership gift is my visionary thinking. You know, my ability to dream and to imagine a different reality. And linked to it is also the passion needed to do this work. I think that this is a crucial precondition for meaningful social change. And another thing would be strategic thinking. I think that in order to achieve set goals, my gift is this ability to think deep and analytically about problems, and then to create a multifaceted creative advocacy strategy or legal strategy needed to move towards the set goal, this vision, this different reality. But above all, I put great importance into values-based leadership. And I think that one of the core values of my core values is empathy, connectedness, my ability to connect with people, to step into their shoes and to do it easily, and to step into the shoes of the other, no matter who they are. I think that this is also a very important integral part of human rights work.
So as we close our conversation today, is there a message or a thought you'd like to leave with me and those who listen?
Oh yeah, I always love, thank you for this question. I always love those questions, because I feel that after a certain period of time, you have to try to pay it forward. So I'm always grateful for this opportunity to share some messages, especially with young aspiring leaders who might be listening to our conversation. I would suggest such aspiring leaders to find their true passion, to find out what it is that makes their heart sink. And once they have found this passion, don't satisfy yourself with just admiring the problem. It is important for leaders to think big, to create a network of allies, and then to make bold steps. However, while always keeping your vision and the horizon you aim to reach in mind, as I have just been talking about in the context of mental health challenges, it is also crucial to accept that it might be a very long journey with many successes and sometimes even more setbacks. You may face criticism or opposition from people who don't share your long-term vision, and sometimes you need to compromise, because often good is better than perfect, and we need to accept that. But it is essential to pick your battles, to maintain this long-term perspective, but to stay focused on your strategy and to hold on to the hope that eventually, through dedicated step-by-step approach, you can get very far. One step at a time can ultimately lead you to your end goal, to your final goal.
Adrijana, it's been an absolute pleasure getting to know you and to have you in conversation with me today as Zonta International's guest on this story, which is about sharing stories. And your powerful story, of course, marks you as a remarkable woman. Zonta International thanks you so much for your time and energy today. And I personally wish you well with the next steps and stages of your career choice and the difference you'll continue to make for our world.
Thank you so much, Lynn. Thank you for inviting me. It's been such a great pleasure to talk to you today.